this video, we're going to talk about how companies can manage growth. And this is really a continuation from some other videos that we've talked about, primarily the videos on forecasting financial statements and creating what we refer to as pro forma statements. If you remember, the outcome from those statements is basically a picture of how we're going to finance the operations of the company and the growth and the changes of sales and any changes in strategy of operations that we might have. So let's talk about this growth as we go through. So if you think about a company that's in a relatively new company, we place that company in what we refer to as a rapid growth phase. Well, when you're young, right, you have lots of sales growth. So you need to invest in things like accounts receivable, inventory, more productive capacity. You probably don't have enough cash to do that. However, once you get to what we refer to as the declining phase, right, typically in this phase, things are slowing down. You still have cash. Cash isn't the problem. The challenge is you don't have any expansion in mind for this company. Most companies never really get to this declining phase without trying to do something, right? They will increase efficiency. They'll buy new plant and equipment. They'll go to another product line, but they'll try to somehow reimagine the way the company works so that this cycle never ends. Here is just a picture of those cycles. Again, startup. I'm sure you realize that most companies that start have a couple of years of losses because they need to what? They need to build sales, right? Once they get to the rapid growth state, sales are coming in like crazy, but now they need assets to keep up with the sales. In maturity, they're going to be generating cash, but they have really no need at this point to find ways to do the business differently. They're making money. In the declining phase, you think about this company is ultimately moving towards its demise, right? So, they're marginally profitable, right? They probably don't have a lot of cash for new products investments. So they got to find a way to, as I mentioned earlier, reimagine the company, or the company will ultimately cease. So the number that we've been talking about with respect to growth rate, the one that we're interested in right now is something called sustainable growth rate, right? So this is the maximum rate the company can grow without depleting financial resources. How can we say that again? This is the maximum growth rate that a company can grow at without needing outside finances to finance operations. How much can you grow using only the profits of the company? So this is on the assumption that the company is not going to sell new equity and is going to maintain a constant debt ratio. So what does this mean, right? So obviously when sales are increasing, we need more assets. Here's the new assets we need as we're growing. How are we going to finance that? We would like to be able to finance that with just the profits of the company. But if the sustainable growth rate is less than the actual growth of the company, we're going to need new financing. In this case, though, we're only looking at debt. We're going to assume the company is not or does not want to issue equity yet. So what is this sustainable growth rate? What is that formula all about? Well, in a nutshell, right, it's the ratio of the change in equity over the year to the equity at the beginning of the period. So this is really a backward-looking ratio, if you will, if you calculate it from financial statements. Of course, we want to know future, right? We don't have that information, but we can kind of extrapolate, if you will, and forecast forward what we think this growth rate will look like, or what it does look like. So here's our formula. Change in equity divided by equity at the beginning. Well, what's the change in equity? Most of the time, we're assuming no issue of common stock, so any change in equity is going to be retained earnings. Divide that by equity. How do we find out what the retained earnings are? It's R, which is the retention ratio. This is the percentage of earnings that are kept by the company. 1 minus R is the dividend payout ratio. How much do you pay out as a percentage of earnings? How much do you retain as a percentage of earnings? So the growth rate here, here's our retention ratio times ROE, right? Return on equity. We can expand that, which is a great thing, right? We talked about this in other videos. This is what we refer to as the DuPont analysis. Return on equity, profit margin times asset turnover times leverage. And here we can put it in an acronym, right? Sustainable growth is the profit ratio times the retained earnings ratio multiplied by asset turnover multiplied by leverage. That will give us our growth ratio, our sustainable growth rate for the company. So here's one of the you try it things, right? So they want us to calculate sustainable growth rate. There's two ways to do this, right? The beginning formula just says you take the change in equity, right? 3126 minus 2950 divided by beginning equity, and that's 6%. Now you can test me on this if you want to pause the video. If you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation, you can look down below and you can see the formula in the notes. If you use the PRAT formula, right, calculate those ratios up above, again, you get the 6%. So what do we know? What does this tell us? We know that what the levers of growth are: profit, retention, asset turnover, leverage, right? So if company, again, grows at greater than this G star, something in those leverage has to change, right? Something has to change to finance or to get to this amount of growth rate here. In fast-growing companies, they typically can't increase profit. They can't retain more money. Their asset efficiency is not easily changed. So in the end, if you're a fast-growing company, how do you make decisions to help with this cash flow issue, with this issue of cash, that you need more? In the end, you're going to have to increase leverage. Another way to look at this is to take, again, it's the combination of financial policy, R and T, right? This is the retention ratio. This is leverage. That's our financing policy. And multiply that by return on assets. Again, this is really just the same basic idea as before. But if we assume that R and T, the financing piece, is constant, we can actually create what they refer to as being a balanced growth, right? Balanced growth is the growth rate that can be self-financed for a given level of profitability, right? Hold these two constant. What is balanced growth? What does that look like graphically, right? So balanced growth is the growth rate, right, that will allow us to finance things from within the company. So we end up with a graph here. And you can see these two lines represent two different companies, if you will. One company, R times T, is 1.4. So this is their balanced growth line. If you're above the line, you have a cash deficit. You need to get more money. If you're below the line, you have a cash surplus. And of course, the differences in the company is what? Retention and leverage. So companies with less leverage and lower retention rates are going to have a line down here. Again, these are two different companies. So anything below one of these lines is a cash surplus. Anything above is a cash deficit. How do we deal with this? That's really what the following videos are going to review. What does the company do? So if you have unbalanced growth, right, there's only a few things you can do. You need to change the growth rate of the company, right? Who wants to reduce sales growth? Nobody. We need to change return on assets. So we either need to change the profitability of the company, increase it, or increase the efficiency of the company. The only other opportunity then is to change something in our financial policy, right? Either change how much earnings we retain or change our financing. And again, as we talk about growing companies, right, typically can't change those other things. The only things they can change are retention and leverage. And most companies at the very beginning don't have any, they don't pay dividends. So their retention is already maxed out, right? So again, the goal is not to have actual growth rate equal to the sustainable growth, but we need to understand, and that's really the purpose of this, is what do you do once you know there's a disparity, right? What decisions does a company make? So let's look at this company, Nobility Homes. Here's 5 years of data. If you look at their growth rate, the sustainable growth rates are very low, but their actual growth rate is very high. So what does this tell us? Every single year of this company's existence, at least these last 5 years, it has grown faster than its sustainable growth rate, which means in order for it to operate, they have had to increase leverage. Did they do that? Well, look, every year here, they have increased their leverage. Retention couldn't change because they're not paying dividends. They're keeping everything. So this means above and beyond all the profit that they've made, they have too much growth and they need to finance that. Again, we could always say, well, let's just slow down growth. But that's just that's not a normal thing to think about doing. And again, this just talks about, right, how do we change this, right? Well, we need, if you want to get to that sustainable growth rate, the average around 25%, we're going to have to increase profitability. We've already maxed out 100% of retained earnings, so we can't do that. We're going to have to increase efficiency, or we're going to have to increase leverage. If you look at the graph, here's the balance growth for the last year. Here's 2012. Of course, every year is in between that. And we see that every single year, the company has been unbalanced, right? It has cash deficits. That doesn't mean they have negative cash. It means their need for cash is greater than the cash that they have. How are they going to sustain the growth of the company that they're anticipating? So as we go forward in these next videos, we're going to attempt to talk about what do you do in these two situations. What do you do if you're a company that has a cash deficit need? And what do you do if you're a company that has cash surpluses? Look forward to seeing you in the next video.